The endless questions that we all filled out in the census last year have yielded a treasure trove of data for property investors and homeowners about the way the housing market will look in the future. There are less of us who own a home outright, there are more lone households, and we're seeing faster population growth, helped in part by immigrants arriving from Asia, namely China and India. Well, to give us his insights, we're joined from Melbourne by property guru Michael Yardney from Metropole Property Strategists. Michael, it's always great to see you and get your insights into what's going on. Now, I know something that you talk about a lot that is key for property markets is demographics.
Yes, Bridie. I believe demographics are going to be more important in shaping the future of our property markets than the short-term ups and downs of interest or government interference. Let me say this: how we live, how many of us there are, where we want to live, how we want to live, that's going to shape the sort of houses that are going to be needed in the future and the sort that are going to be in popular demand, and that's what investors need to know about.
Michael, what were the biggest trends in the census that can give us some insight into where we should invest?
Sure. Well, every 5 years the Australian government conducts a census, and then each time after that the Australian Bureau of Statistics upgrades its data projections for population, and then the government uses it, big businesses use it to allocate their resources. And I think similarly property investors should look at that data as well to see what's going to be popular in the future. And the first big surprise was there are more of us than we thought there were. So despite all the population forecasts, last year our population grew by well over 300,000 people. But it didn't grow evenly, and it grew for two reasons. Number one, it grew because we're making more babies. We made over 300,000. Sorry, is that the right way of saying it? Made 300,000 babies last year. We had over 311,000 births. But interestingly, 55% of our population growth was related to migration. And so therefore the data projections of how many of us there are and how many are going to need accommodation have been increased. And interestingly, it was mainly in the capital cities. And if you break down migration further, if you take into account Victoria and New South Wales, 76% of the migration occurred there. Add Queensland to it, and there was only about 12% of migration occurring elsewhere. And when we talk about those states, in general, we're really talking about Melbourne and Sydney capital cities rather than regional, and Brisbane as well rather than the whole of Queensland. And interestingly, the migration occurred in particular from younger age groups, 25s to 32s. Now, I remember a few years ago when we were worried about the baby boomers retiring, and we were thinking that as they retire, they're going to move out of the workforce and they're going to use up the healthcare system and the pension because they haven't got enough super, and it was necessary to have a new wave of young people, keen people, earning, bringing income into the system, paying taxes, and that's exactly what's happening. So there's a new wave of young people coming in, and also they're in general in the household formation age group, 25s to 35s. So how they're going to live and where they're going to live and the sort of accommodation they want is pretty important moving forward.
And Michael, are we still attached to the big backyards and the detached house, or is there a noticeable increase in people in apartment living or medium density townhouse style living?
Well, as you drive through our cities, you see all these apartments being built. So what I thought we'd find was that there was going to be a higher percentage of people living in apartments. And I was wrong, but so are a lot of the other researchers. Interestingly, the percentage of people living in apartments is much the same. 14% of Australians this time round, 14% of people last time round. Fewer people are living in detached houses. Interestingly, the increase was in townhouses. There was a significant increase in the number of people living in what in some states you'd call duplexes, but in other words, large modern accommodation on compact blocks. So yes, we still like our plot of dirt, don't we?
Sure do. Michael, we've mentioned, that surge in the 25 to 32-year-olds, the numbers in Melbourne as well. Do developers take this data and go, OK, well, we're seeing a rise here, here and here, let's build for them?
That would be good if they did do that, but I think in general developers really basically try and squeeze as many apartments as they can onto a block of land that they buy because of the high costs. And the other thing with the big projects are there are very, very long lead times. The things being completed this year, the big complexes, really came into fruition 4 or 5 years ago, long before all this happened. Of course, it's the right way to try and do things, but we're building too much of the wrong accommodation, I believe. Now, having said that, I think one of the lessons out of the census is that a lot of our migrants coming from China and India, as you already said, Bridie, are probably going to look for different styles of accommodation than maybe other people who've come from other backgrounds, so they will be comfortable living in high-rise accommodation. They're more likely to be comfortable living in medium and high-rise accommodation. So just getting back to your other point, I just remembered you asked about people living in apartments. Yeah, still 14% of us, but interestingly, more of them are high-rise apartments as a percentage than the low-rise 2-3-storey walk-ups. And the number of people living in houses came to about 71% of us living in detached separate houses. But another interesting thing is that rents went up about 17% in that 5-year census period, a little bit more than inflation, but in fact didn't keep up at all with the rise in property values. Property values in Sydney and Melbourne did that almost in the last year, not in 5 years. So investors, if you think about it, the yields, their rents didn't keep up with inflation, but they got the good, keep up with capital growth, but they got the good capital growth.
So what are the key takeouts then that investors should be thinking about when they're choosing where to buy, what to buy?
Well, I think what you've got to do is understand what's going to be the most common the sort of accommodation that's going to be in strong demand in the future, but not by tenants, by owner-occupiers, because it's owner-occupiers that are going to buy similar properties to what you own that are going to push up the values. And so I believe it's the 3 big capital cities of Australia, and I also believe it should be in the middle and inner ring suburbs, because as this population keeps growing, and it is growing very quickly, proximity to transport, proximity to infrastructure, proximity to workplaces and amenities is going to become very important. Melbourne was the fastest growing capital city, growing about 150% bigger than its 20-year averages. So Melbourne grew at 2.4% per annum. If you think about that, in the next 5 years, it's going to grow by more than 10% our population. Where are we going to put them all? That's a really good question to think about.
Yeah, fantastic. Great to get your insights there, Michael, as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Michael Yardney there from Metropole.